So welcome everyone to this Policy and Practice seminar hosted by the UCL Department of Political Science together with the UCL European Institute. My name is Michal Ovadek. I'm a lecturer in the Department of Political Science and I'll be chairing this evening. The topic tonight is what can we expect from the European Parliament elections? So in June of this year, citizens all over the EU will be going to the ballot boxes to elect for the 10th time, actually. I noticed this is the 10th time since 1979 that we have direct elections of the European Parliament. And voters in 27 member states will be electing a total of 720 MEPs. And even though the EP elections are perhaps the most far-reaching experiment in transnational democracy, they're more like a series of national elections than a single European one. For one, the elections do not take place on the same evening or same day. They're spread over several days, depending on the country you're voting in. And there's also been no agreement on the implementation of a transnational list, so MEPs will be once again elected from national party lists. Germans, for example, will elect 96 parliamentarians, the most of any nation, while the Maltese, Luxembourgers, or Cypriots are going to be getting 6 each. According to most projections, the combined seat share of the EPP, SD, and Renew Europe, the 3 traditionally biggest groups in the parliament, will drop following the elections to just over 50%. Which might make the outcomes of votes in the European Parliament more uncertain in the next 5 years. This and many other storylines the upcoming EP elections are bound to provide will be discussed by our esteemed panelists, and let me introduce them. We have, just next to me, Dr. Heather Graby, who is a senior fellow at Bruegel and visiting professor at UCL and KU Leuven. A political scientist, she researches the political economy of the European Green Deal and how the climate transition will change the EU's international relationships and external policies. She was previously director of the Open Society European Policy Institute in Brussels and earlier deputy director of the Centre for European Reform in London. Next to her is sitting Professor Sarah Hobbold, who holds the Sutherland Chair in European Institutions in the Department of Government, London School of Economics and Political Science. She has published extensively on elections, referendums, public opinion, and European Union politics. She's the chair of European Election Studies, an EU-wide project studying voters, parties, candidates, and the media in European parliamentary elections. Her most recent book, co-authored with Catherine de Vries, is Political Entrepreneurs, The Rise of Challenger Parties in Europe. And finally, we have Tony Barber with us, who is European comment editor of the Financial Times. He's a former foreign correspondent in Austria, Belgium, Germany, Italy, Poland, the former Soviet Union, the US, and former Yugoslavia. That's a very long list of countries. 2012. In 2012, he was awarded the Medal of Gratitude by the Solidarity Center in Gdańsk in recognition of his work in support of freedom and democracy in Poland. Welcome, everyone. So just about the format, each speaker will offer opening remarks of about 5 to 7 minutes, and then we'll have a panel discussion. And finally, there'll be, of course, space for your questions. A final note before I hand over to the speakers. The whole session, including the Q&A, is being recorded and will be posted online on the department's website, our YouTube channel, and our podcast after the event. If you speak, you'll be heard in the recording. If you don't speak, you will not. How about we start with Tony?
Yes, thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. So I'm going to say a few words about the party political groups that are fighting this election, mostly about the centre-right, the European People's Party, centre-left, the Social Democrats or Socialists, and the Greens, and I'll maybe fit in something on the hard-right nationalist or Eurosceptic parties as well. Now, to understand where we are with these groups, just a very quick sort of survey of where things have gone since the first election, 1979. From then until roughly 2004, 2009, it tended to be more or less the same result every time. By a long way, the centre-right and centre-left topped the polls. Initially, it was actually the centre-left that came first, and then that changed. I think it was 1999, I think the centre-right for the first time became the largest party group. And this was a rather cosy arrangement, and you would find in European Parliament votes that the two sides would actually often vote together on issues, because those are the days when the EU affairs, or European Community affairs as it was back then, were often thought of as a kind of elite project or a technocratic one, devoid to a large extent of the hurly-burly of politics. Well, that gradually changed as the activities of the EU extended into more and more areas that had previously been part of domestic politics. And the EU became a more politicized arena. And that meant that new types of parties and party groups began to spring up. And then suddenly what you see at the time of really 2009 onwards, but particularly the last two EU elections, 2014, 2019, is the vote for the mainstream centre-right and centre-left starts to shrink. And you go, well, why would this happen? The obvious thing to do is look for events in the last roughly 14, 15 years. And the first thing, of course, is the great financial crisis, 2008 onwards, that evolved into a kind of both a kind of massive recession, but also a huge threat to the integrity of the Eurozone. And then in 2015, you get the what's often called the refugee and migrant crisis. But there were other things. So those, because of the sheer challenge they represented to policy making, expanded the room for criticism of these mainstream parties for their apparent ineffectiveness in getting to grips with those events. In addition to that, you had the emergence of climate change as a major issue, which at first provided a kind of boost for green parties, particularly in countries with proportional representation, and in Western and Northern Europe. But as time has passed, that issue, particularly in the last couple of years, has tended to backfire a little bit for green parties, because what's become more apparent to voters in some countries is the sheer cost of pursuing these green policies. And in a country like Germany, where the Greens, a few months before the 2021 election, the Bundestag election, were in fact top of the polls for a short while. You look at them now, I mean, they've really been hit by a reaction against as the awareness has dawned of the cost of these policies. And probably no party is hated more in Eastern Germany, the former communist East, than the Greens. So looking at first a little bit at the centre-right group, one needs to keep in mind, I think, that just as the centre-left it's well known that it's suffered over the long term because of the decline of the organised working class, the decline of trade unions, decline of the factory-based working class, I should say, really. The right has also suffered from social, cultural and economic change, and in particular, with the gradual emergence of a well-educated and more progressive-minded middle class, the mainstream centre-right has been pulled in one direction by that element of society to kind of keep its more liberal-minded vote. But on the other hand, it's been pulled to the far, what we might call the more extreme right, on issues of migration and national identity, even in some countries, Islam. So the mainstream centre-right, it's pulled in two directions, and therefore its vote and its own sense of purpose is a little bit uncertain. And what we do see, of course, is a tendency on these issues of migration and identity. We see more and more the tendency to not fully align with the hard right, but at least to borrow some of the rhetoric and perhaps some of the policies. On the centre left, meanwhile, you'd have to say that the problem has been, apart from those long-term issues I mentioned earlier, that much of the core electorate now is a kind of liberal-minded middle class. Certainly one that's been educated to university level. And if you look at the recent Dutch elections, I mean, it was very striking how the vote for the Dutch Labour Party and the Greens came almost exclusively from that section of the electorate, whereas the voters from lower down the social scale tended to go more to Wilders' party. So those are more or less my thoughts. I think that perhaps I should just add a couple of thoughts that come to mind, which is the position of the mainstream right has been particularly difficult in, say, France, where I mean, I think the kind of symbolic moment, the first symbolic moment, was the 2017 presidential election, where no centre-right candidate made it through to the second round. Of course, no socialist did either, so it was a symbolic moment for the left as well. And then in Germany, you know, the 2021 election, the CDU, I mean, that was actually its lowest vote ever since the Second World War in a Bundestag election. So all these things lead me to conclude that at the European Parliament elections this time, you will see a continued squeeze on the mainstream parties and perhaps on the Greens, without resulting in an earthquake result, I should stress. Some advances for the hard right, far right, whatever you want to call it, but not resulting, certainly enough to perhaps make them able to disrupt policy making in the areas for which the European Parliament has some responsibility, like trade or climate change, but not so much foreign policy perhaps, because the European Parliament doesn't have an actual voice in that. But anyway, not an earthquake, although advances to go by the polls seems likely. Thank you.
Shall I? Well, thank you. I think it's on. Yeah. So after, I mean, that was of course a brilliant overview of what is likely to happen, but also how voting behavior in European Parliament elections have evolved. I think I'll zoom in on a bit more on one of the things that you probably will see covered most in the European and Anglo-Saxon press, which is the rise of the far right. Although I will say perhaps sometimes it's a bit overstated how much that will perhaps mean in terms of European legislation. But I'll still zoom in on it a bit, because I think that is, if we look at the polls, and they're both polls and there's also prediction models of what will happen. And both of the kind of poll of polls and the prediction models are all saying that the big sort of news story is exactly like Tony was saying, this sort of fragmentation, further fragmentation of the European Parliament, but also a shift to the right. And a particular concern is the shift to the radical populist right. So that's the sort of, I think, what will be the big news story. It's not surprising that we're seeing that, because, of course, one of the things that European Parliament elections are a reflection of is really the public moods in each of the member states that was mentioned in the introduction. And if we look at the big member states, the ones that give most of the seats to the European Parliament, in all of those member states, I mean Poland, the exception being Poland, we've seen a sort of shift towards the populist radical right. Of course, they are in power in Italy with Meloni. In France, they could be in power after the next presidential elections, but certainly Marine Le Pen, traditionally have done very well, and before her father, in European Parliament elections. And in Germany, perhaps the most radical shift recently has been the rise of the AfD in the polls, and they're likely to do very well in the European Parliament election, partly due to dissatisfaction with the ruling coalition. They're now sort of polling in national voting election, about 20-odd%. We can come back to the Germans, but I think the AfD in Germany is perhaps particularly concerning, because what we've looked at, often when the radical right grows in strength, like they've done in France or in Italy, it's accompanied by a kind of moderation. And what we're seeing in Germany is really a radicalization of their message and growing at the same time. So that's why, in some ways, the German it experiences a bit more worrying. So on the one hand, European Parliament elections are therefore a reflection of the national public moods. And what has happened, not just in the European Parliament elections, but domestically across Europe, is a fragmentation of politics. We just see a weakening, as Tony was saying, of the mainstream, and more parties, both on the radical left and then the radical right and green parties, but particularly what the main new sort of challenger party families that's done well is the populist radical right. Of course, there are exceptions, but that's the general trend. And particularly when immigration is highly salient, which it is at the moment in Europe. We saw in COVID, the radical right was doing somewhat worse because that's often there you want a kind of competent mainstream people where you think they can govern. Maybe sometimes they can't, even if you think they can, but that's what you sort of turn to as voters. But now when COVID is over, the pandemic is over, we have a cost of living crisis. Interestingly, although often it's not necessarily the economy alone driving this, but immigration has again become more salient, and then we see a resurgence now of the radical right in most European countries. So that's one thing you can take away. The other particular characteristic that's important when you think of voting behavior in European Parliament election is that they allow voters, because they are, as political scientists, we like to call them second-order national elections, by which we mean that they are not the elections where voters turn to who do we want to be the government, but rather they're the elections where they can vote more expressively. That might be sincerely, or it might be a kind of protest vote against, oh, we certainly don't want that lot. So we've always seen people freer to vote for challenger parties like the Greens, but also like the radical right, because they don't feel they have to, they're so constrained by worrying about, oh, this party is actually going to be in government. So that means that there's generally the governing parties, whoever is in government just does worse, and smaller, more radical parties always do better. Interestingly, that hasn't changed that much, even though the European Parliament has radically changed. So the European Parliament has gone from being a sort of assembly that was consulted on legislation to being a proper co-legislator in European Parliament elections. So they're very strong in terms of policy making in the EU. However, I think it's probably not wholly unfair to say that they've sort of failed in becoming this sort of mandate for the public, thinking this is what we want European policy making to be, oh, so we're voting in that way, which was, of course, the mission they set out with originally. So they still hold this sort of, they're still largely domestic, although not wholly domestic contest. Now, the third thing I wanted to say was that that has a spillover effect that's quite important when we look at the radical right on domestic politics. Because voters often feel freer to vote for more radical parties in European Parliament elections. What research has shown is that that has in fact meant that European Parliament elections is often a kind of springboard for these parties to become more established domestically. We've seen that with what was Front National, National Front in France. Of course, Britain makes it quite hard domestically to make inroads into national politics, but certainly they made UKIP more important, I think, as a force in British politics because they've done so well. And we've seen that in a number of parties, in a number of countries where these parties struggled to establish themselves, and they became, not only did they get an electoral presence, but it also became institutionalized. I recently talked to a French centre-right MEP, said, all of a sudden they had all this money to hire all this staff, so they could hire good staff, they could hire good PR people. Then, in fact, they took the Gaullists, they took the Republicans' PR people because, now it was. Now they were a big party because of all the money they got through the European Parliament. So it has this effect, and there's kind of, fancy quantitative studies in political science that shows that once you make an entry and you do well in European Parliament elections, that has a spillover effect on subsequent national elections. So in that sense, European Parliament, this is probably what I think the founders will probably think is an unintended consequence in some ways that they have had on domestic politics. And also perhaps a kind of normalization. When you see, they were the second largest or the largest party, we've also seen that in Italy, for example, well, that must mean they are sort of a main, it's a normal party that we can vote for domestically. Just my final point is I want to turn back to what that means for European politics, and Heather will talk more more incisively about what does that then mean? Let's say we have a quarter of the seats from the kind of conservative Eurosceptic right all the way to the kind of extreme right in the European Parliament, if the polls are to believe. Of course, that greater fragmentation will make it harder to govern, but still, as was mentioned, the polls still suggest that there is still this kind of grand coalition. It's not the kind of adversarial politics we have in Britain where it's one side wins or the other side. We still most likely will have a majority for the EPP, the SNP and Renew, or some kind of, maybe with the Greens, some kind of the mainstream parties. Now, where they will differ on certain issues, but where they're often in agreement is they tend to be much more pro-European, for example, and there will be many issues where they will still want to collaborate. They will certainly also not be able to make a kind of more permanent agreement that they will work together with the radical right. That doesn't mean they wouldn't. And that's, for example, still at this moment for Germany, it's unthinkable that the CDU would say, yeah, it's fine, we can work with the group that the AfD sits in. I mean, that might shift in German politics, that's a big question, but at the moment it wouldn't. Similarly, in Poland, Tusk would not be keen, particularly even to work with his predecessors, Law and Justice, Peace. So there's kind of domestic things that spill over into the willingness of the centrist parties to work on a more permanent basis with the radical right. The other important thing to mention is that when you look at the voting behavior, for example in ID, but also ECR, but particularly ID, which is where the populist radical right, most of them sit, is they are not a cohesive group. They make a lot of noise, but they don't vote together in anywhere near the kind of proportions that the mainstream group. So that means even if they vote together, let's say they have a sort of cohesiveness score of like 60% of the time, that means they don't actually make up the kind of numbers that they look like they have. Doesn't mean they can't be disruptive or it won't change the dynamics, but it means they can't be counted on as a group where you say, okay, we have these votes, because they actually don't agree on a lot of things. So that might mean that the impact of these elections might be greater on domestic politics and therefore also European politics through the domestic channel, i.e. through who sits in the council and the pressure on those who sit in the council than necessarily the direct legislative impact. But Heather will have more to say on that, so I'll turn over. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Yes. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Yes, I very much agree with your analysis and just add, if you look at the behaviour of radical populist parties in the European Parliament, they do tend to use it as a cash machine. Some of them, of course, have been then caught and found to be using money directly for domestic campaigns, which is illegal, and they've actually been convicted for that. So there's a high rate of that. Many of them, however, don't actually turn up. For example, Marine Le Pen, there was a study of her actual participation in European Parliament votes, and certainly, she didn't appear in committees and so on. So their actual participation in the European Parliament is often not there. They may vote, because you can also do that remotely, but they don't take up positions of power in the Parliament, like being rapporteurs of reports or chairs of committees on the whole. And they also are highly selective about which issues they actually get involved with. So they might make a big speech, which they, will have recorded and put up on YouTube about, say, migration, an issue that most of them will always jump on. But on most of the legislative files, they're not really present. So the number of policies that they're actually interested in and want to talk about is very limited. Some have used the Parliament as their primary YouTube channel. Nigel Farage did that very effectively, for example, but many don't show up. So it's really quite a mixed bag. And the other thing, just to mention, you talked about the cohesiveness of ID in terms of voting. ID and ECR, the Conservatives and Reformists, don't get on, and they are rivals even more than they are with the right parties. So even if you may well see lots of headlines about the size of the overall radical right number of seats, but they won't vote together, and they probably wouldn't even form a coalition among themselves, let alone with the mainstream right. So this is, and this is also typical of behaviour also in national politics, actually. And so that's where the link up between the results of the parliament elections and national elections is really important. You know, we've got elections coming up. So we've got Giorgia Meloni in power in Italy. We've got Fratelli d'Italia in power in Italy. The FPÖ is likely to be, the Freedom Party in Austria is likely to be the biggest party and may end up doing a coalition again with the centre-right, but as the largest party this time, and being able to have the chancellor in Austria. And of course, we've still got this will he or won't he about Geert Wilders forming a government in the Netherlands. The latest news seems to be that he actually doesn't want to become prime minister. So there is a difference between radical right parties that go into power and ones that stay out. And I think Wilders is a classic example of somebody who's usually chosen to stay out of power. Much better to shout from the sidelines than actually to be responsible for policies and ministerial portfolios and so on. The opposite extreme is Viktor Orban, who definitely wants to be in power and has actually managed a one-party takeover of state institutions since he's been in power since 2010. But so there's a real variety of behaviors once in power, in politics, whether they want to be in power or prefer to stay in the sidelines, whether they actually show up and get involved in policy, and whether they involve themselves in policies beyond migration. This is all highly variable, and on the whole, they don't. They pick and choose their issues. But the one thing where all of these parties unite and where they really agree, which is very significant because of their role, their increasing role in all of the institutions, not just the European Parliament, but remember that they will have more commissioners in the Commission than ever before, and they will have more leaders in the Council and the European Council than ever before. The one thing you see, particularly from those in power, is they don't want the EU to do more. Now, why is that? Because if you think of, I should be using, of course, the definition that Sarah uses in her book of challenger parties, but I'm going to use Cass Mudder's definition of a populist radical right. Populism of the radical right kind is a thin-centred ideology. So it's thin-centred in that it doesn't have much of a policy agenda. It's highly flexible, actually, about many, many issues. They can jump from one issue to another with great flexibility, not very coherent program ideologically. But what is very clearly there is that they posit, their general claim is the elites are not working in the interests of the people. I represent the will of the people, and I'm going to fight for you against all of these elites. And even parties in power make that claim. So, for example, Viktor Orban, Fidesz, has been in power since 2010 in Hungary, and for him, the elite he is fighting is Brussels. It's the EU. Sometimes it's also George Soros and various others he claims to be in world government, but it's fighting the EU. In other countries where they're not in power, it's fighting the elite of that country. I mean, that's the classic Le Pen argument. It's a classic AfD argument. But this idea of fighting the elites and working on behalf of what the people want and claiming to know and represent what the people want is the classic thing. So, of course, you're not going to want to do very much at EU level, because what is the EU? The EU is elites negotiating with foreign elites, even worse. Foreign elites are even less to be trusted than your national elite. And even worse, the EU is a giant compromise-making machine. So it's our elites, whom we already don't trust, negotiating to create compromises on our national interests with those foreign elites. I mean, what is there to like about this? So that's where the kind of nationalist agenda of all of these parties is fundamentally going to be against the EU acting in new areas. But having said that, once they get into power, these parties can actually be remarkably flexible on specific policies. So once they are the elite and having to negotiate with the foreign elites. For example, Giorgia Meloni, despite her anti-immigrant stance and that of Fratelli d'Italia in Italy, has been arguing in the European Council for more legal routes for migrant workers. Very aware of the massive labour shortages in Italy, for example, in the care sector. I mean, nobody would be taking care of the anziani in Italy if it weren't for foreign workers coming in. So that flexibility that's a classic example of that kind of flexibility. Viktor Orban has of course, in the European Council, and the Council famously blocked many, many things. But then he can also, at the last minute, suddenly give up the ghost and carry on. So that's where there's a sort of unpredictability about how this will affect the functioning of the EU. There are also two conflicting trends that we see when these parties are in coalition government in particular. One is a sort of contagion effect that, for example, if a Hungarian minister starts asking the Commission for exemptions from sanctions for Hungarian banks, then it's very hard for the Austrian minister not to do the same. So what you can find is that it actually becomes harder to reach compromises because the populist radical right will hold out on particular issues. And because they're not too bothered about what in political science is called the multi-level games of the European Union. On the whole, countries make compromises because they want to stay friends with other countries who might give them favors in the next game. So the fact that you have this sort of sequence of games means that there's a reason to compromise. But if you have a very limited range of interests, you only want to get a few things, then you may not do that if you're a populist radical right party. But then the opposite tendency, so there's a contagion tendency in terms of blocking in the EU and not reaching agreement, which is highly problematic in a system that is still very dependent on unanimity in a number of areas. But the other issue, the other trend we can see is socialization. Often on issues they haven't been exposed to before, the party will come into government and then go, actually, these policies are not so bad once you look at them, and they're not so disruptive in government. We've seen this with the Finns party, for example, who took the foreign ministry in Finland. Similarly, you could argue in Austria, FPÖ ministers have actually been less decisive in changing migration and asylum policy than VP, than the centre-right. So again, the policy impact is unpredictable. But I think it matters greatly that there will be more commissioners and more leaders, more ministers in the Council and prime ministers in the European Council. I would watch that because of the fact, as Sarah said, of the way that this has a legitimization function on parties once they've got into the European Parliament. So we've had in this past commission a Fidesz commissioner. There will now be also a Fratelli d'Italia commissioner. So divvying up of portfolios is one way that Ursula von der Leyen can manage this situation. She can decide on giving portfolios she doesn't think will be terribly important to these commissioners. You can argue about whether you think that's a good idea or not, but essentially it means that there will be more voices in the college on issues and particularly on this question of where the EU should the EU be doing more in one area or another. So that matters. And then in the Council and the European Council, the situation has got quite complicated because radical right populists in the past used to argue, hey, we think it would be a good idea that if the EU won't do what we want, that our country should leave the EU. Are you afraid? These days, nobody's afraid of that. Huxit, Polexit, Frexit, it has no credibility whatsoever. Nobody will ever argue for this ever again. Thank you very much, Nigel Farage. You have achieved something great for European integration. So there's a huge chilling effect. But instead, what you see is Orban, for example, he used to argue that Huxit might happen. Now he says, no, he made a speech 2 weeks ago saying, I'm not interested in exiting the EU, I'm going to conquer the EU in alliance with the new Austrian government that's about to come, he says, the Slovak government, the Italian government, and the Serbian government, not in the EU, but of a similar mindset. So his kind of hostage-taking and blocking tactics, because he doesn't care too much about common objectives, that the idea is that he could form a new Visegrad group, which is of a very different complexion. So this could matter. It could matter a lot, depending on the national elections, which are to follow these European Parliament elections. And it matters also on two areas. One is the green transition. I won't go into detail here, but we've basically, the legislative frameworks are there thanks to the European Green Deal, but now we're entering a period of national implementation and where the EU needs to find money to do a lot of this implementation. So blocking tactics on the green transition could be really very significant. And also, there are going to be some very difficult decisions to take about defense, supporting Ukraine, and orientation on Russia, especially depending on the US election result in November. If the EU has to take on the main burden of supporting Ukraine, both financially and in terms of armaments, providing arms, how is that going to be feasible if there are openly pro-Russian parties in the European Parliament and also in the Council and the European Council, blocking sanctions, for example, blocking financial packages, blocking, for example, joint procurement of armaments. This becomes a very serious set of issues. Also on enlargement, let's not forget that every single member state has about 140 veto points for Ukraine's accession process, for example. So that means that, again, more pro-Russian votes in the Council and more could make a difference there. But I would point out, though, I think Meloni is again the one to watch. She's very interesting in both, and I'm sure that Tony will have views on this, but both in how she's behaved in the European Council, but she's also the one really prominent populist leader who is anti-Kremlin and pro-NATO. So she's doing populist a different way. So will others start to follow her? Could she become the anti-Orban populist? I leave that to you to think about.
Great. Thank you, everyone, for these wonderful introductory remarks. I think we learned quite a lot. I'm afraid we are slightly behind schedule, so I'm inclined to open the discussion immediately to the audience so that we get as many of these as possible. And I'm sure they're going to touch upon things that we haven't touched upon yet, such as how are the elections going to impact the formation of the new commission potentially? Is there some scope for if it's going to be another von der Leyen commission? Is she going to be looking for votes among the far right as well? Maybe not. Maybe yes. If we have any questions, I think we can start collecting them. I see some of my wonderful students already being active, so I like to see that. Ignace.
Hi, hello. Can you hear me? Is everything okay? Thank you for this talk. I just wanted to ask, especially everyone, especially on the last point that the third speaker mentioned about potential American departure from the EU in terms of like the results of the American election. In November, right? And in terms of if President Trump, future potentially President Trump is elected, and what that means for European policy. And my question is like this: since the rise of the far-right parties in the parliament, which is a given essentially, it just depends on the numbers. Is it just the case that they will make the EU more dysfunctional, or is it the case that in terms of the changing geopolitical situation in Europe, they will perhaps be more productive and argue for greater European protectionism or greater European cooperation in certain kinds of areas, whether that be migration or even arms procurement, not necessarily for Ukraine, but in terms of the structures in Europe?
Thank you. Is there anyone who would like to take this?
Well, as regards, as regards the impact of a possible second term for Trump. Yeah, it's on. As regards to possible second Trump term, well, I mean, we should be cautious. We don't know. We don't know exactly what he would say or do with regard to NATO and the American security umbrella. He's said certain things recently, but would it be different? Would there in fact be some grown-ups, in quotes, in his if he had another administration? But let's take the most extreme case, and he did say things that basically shattered the credibility of the American security guarantee. Well, I mean, the short answer is it would be a desperate situation for Europe, because whatever the increases in defense spending recently and the promises of more and the efforts to do joint procurement and all this, I mean, these things take years to actually bear fruit. And then so the immediate consequence would be a Europe that felt rather vulnerable. Would it mean that somehow some kind of immense collective spirit to do something in the defense area would spring up? Well, you might hope for that, but I think it's more likely, in fact, that you would get a succession of European national leaders trooping on or getting on the first flight to Washington and begging on their knees for the Americans to defend their own country. And I'm thinking in particular of, you could imagine Meloni going there and saying, look, I'm on your side. Come on, we're the same sort of people. You could imagine a Polish leader saying, look, we're spending far exactly as you asked for. We're doing it. So I think it would be a rather unseemly situation, I'm afraid. But we don't know what would... it's uncertain exactly what attitude Trump might take. He might be more of a blackmailer than a destroyer, kind of holding a gun to the Europeans' head, do what I say, kind of thing. As regards, would the expanded representation of the far right lead to more joint effort and things like, I wouldn't have thought so in the defence area. No. You mentioned migration. I'm not sure that they would have the lead role in forming policy on an area like the larger national governments are the ones that sort of have most sway on something like that. And the key thing, I talked about the centre right earlier on. The thing to watch is the attitudes of those parties and the governments where the centre right is the main force, because obviously their policies in these areas have tended to harden and maybe not become identical with those of those parties further right, but certainly a harder line. So I'd watch them more than the radical right.
That was a very comprehensive answer, I would say. Joanne had a question from the audience. We have several, maybe just behind you.
Thank you. So my question would be, given the potential rise of the far right, you would think, for example, that maybe the centre right is a bit like, will try to appease kind of its electorate, and then my question would be, what do you think, how would that determine like the agenda and the European Commission's like priorities? Like, I don't know, there's a feeling, at least to me, that obviously at the end of the Commission now, there's kind of a more defensive position instead of like constructing and keeping the Green Deal. And so what could the new Commission do? Like, what it could be its priorities, or what might it hold back? Will the Green Deal and all that will that just be put in the backseat, and then or would there the Ukraine be a new priority, or what could happen?
Maybe I can say something on the party strategy, and you can maybe say more about the policy. Just on the party strategy, I think generally, this is not the first time, of course, that the mainstream is being pressured by the radical populist right. We've had decades of that now in immigration, and generally, sort of, as political scientists, we like to talk about the sort of three strategies. You can accommodate, which is what you're suggesting. You just move the same direction. You can take an adversarial strategy, so you can actually make the argument for the opposite, or you can try and be kind of dismissive and pretend it doesn't exist, which is it's a bit like the sort of Labour Party Brexit strategy. Brexit, was that even a thing? EU. So that's sometimes, because what you don't want to do, that would be the thing. You don't want voters to think about that. You want them to think about something else. So I think on immigration, these parties have tried a bit of everything. They tried to, for a long time, not talk about it, and that didn't really work. And now I think generally, although there's some variation, there's been more of an accommodative strategy. In other words, we are also going to talk tough on immigration, although there have been certain party leaders that have made a kind of a positive case for it, but generally it's more like, oh yeah, it's a problem, we're also going to solve it. They sort of stop the boats. Rishi Sunak is an example of someone very much an accommodative, we're also going to be really tough on this, even though in policy terms not, immigration going up, because, the policy might make sense, but certainly in rhetoric. Now, I think the next big area, this is just a sort of prediction looking at where voters are, where we're going to see more accommodation by the mainstream right, is on climate policy. Skepticism was mentioned by both the other panelists. Because what you see right now, actually, in the policy positions and the rhetoric, is there's only really one party group that's consistently critical of the sort of new Green Deal and climate policy responses, and that's the radical right. And they have increased their rhetoric on this and become more adversarial. I think they see it next to immigration as the new big thing they can mobilize voters on. Of course, there's domestic differences, like in Germany, there's also Ukraine and stuff, but otherwise that's the big thing. And if you look at where the most climate policy skeptic voters are in the mainstream parties, it's definitely on the center right. So I feel that's, you can imagine center right parties going different directions, but that's where I think they're going to get nervous. Much less the sort of center-left is much less split on it, their voter base, but the center-right, they probably, when these policies become more costly, they're going to start getting nervous. We saw it, you have one by-election in the UK, and the Conservatives go, oh, actually, you don't want to they didn't hug a husky, didn't they? They hugged something else, and then there was anyway. It's no, actually we don't have to quite do as much, and I think in Germany, France, you could see similar things. That's just a sort of prediction based on your sort of issue. What will the mainstream do? And I exactly agree that it's very important. You know, the radical right don't only have policy influence when they're in government; they have policy influence when the mainstream and especially the mainstream center-right gets nervous and gets like, oh, if that's what voters want, we look at as, you know, the sort of one by-election is a sort of, and then you have a massive policy reaction to that, even to a party that didn't even have any seats. You know, a kind of, and you get that, and then I think the sort of, sadly, I think for the climate, I think that will be a major new area of contestation, and I think I could imagine a kind of more accommodating strategy. Of course, other parties then might go very adversarial and actually make it part of their platform, because there are lots of lots of voters, and increasingly also generationally voters, who think this is the major issue. So I don't think everyone will accommodate, and you could see maybe the center-left going more adversarial, but I could see the center-right becoming more and more nervous. But that's a sort of prediction based on what their voters look like.
Yeah, essentially the green wedge is the next big thing, I think, for the far right. About 5 years ago, I started doing a project called Green Wedge with Catherine Fieschi about how easy it would be to replace migration with climate if migration's less salient. And then COVID kind of made that go quiet for a bit, for the reasons you said, and now here it is roaring back. But I think you've got to think about this time-wise in terms of climate, because climate is different from other policies in that real nasty things are going to happen to us physically. It's not an issue that just goes up and down with the economic cycle or with the political cycle. Europe is warming at twice the global average. The wildfires and floods and heat waves are going to hit us summer after summer for years to come. So I think what's interesting is, will that cause actually much more polarization among voters? At the moment, we see a strategy of accommodation going on, whereby particularly the center-right, I mean, look at the CDU's massive U-turn on things like Nature Restoration Directive. They're accommodating the far right by not going into denial about climate. The AfD actually does climate denial. They're one of the few parties that does that, whereas the CDU is doing what most of the far-right parties are doing, as the center-right party doing, which is, well, we're not really sure if these measures are going to work, and, you know, they're really very, very expensive, so we should just take a pause. So it's delay rather than denial. But the problem with delay is when you then have a series of extremely expensive extreme weather events and other problems, it becomes harder to argue against climate policies. So I think that there will be more adversarial reactions over time, and particularly, of course, that's when the Greens and the centre-left will come in and say, hang on a sec, isn't cleaning up after all these floods really very expensive? And we will start to see more adaptation strategies. It may not still, I mean, it's a very complex issue, climate, and it may still not be good for mitigation, but I think it will lead to a lot more attention to adaptation. But the dismiss part of this, which was the initial strategy, I mean, I think it is over. We're now seeing much more polarization. But what's really important also about climate, which again is different from other issues that the populists tend to go for, including migration, is the really quite massive generation gap. So there's some really interesting work recently, both polling but also focus groups in France and Germany. Jan Eichhorn has done some really interesting things at Depart, showing that there's a significant difference between the kinds of measures that younger and older voters are willing to support. Actually, most Europeans still are worried, really worried about climate. The difference is about what they think should be done about it. So to give you a kind of a caricature of what they found in this most recent research is older people are thinking about where they're going to invest their pensions. They're thinking maybe about heat pumps, electric vehicles, but they're hearing a lot of disinformation about that too. Whereas young people are much more interested in collective action, changing diets, and mobility. They don't have a car yet, so I'll stick to the bicycle. So it's tofu eating, going on marches, branches, riding a bike. Whereas with the older ones, it's where do I invest my pension and should I buy a heat pump because I already own a house and a car, you know. So you can see why there are these differences. But that could mean more generational splits for voters. And one thing I would love the CDU to think about very carefully is whether they're cannibalizing their own vote, because they're maximizing the grey vote in this European Parliament election and getting more older voters who are worried about the cost of the climate transition at the cost of potentially alienating the 16 to 30-year-olds for life from voting for them.
Whoa. We have quite a few more questions. Maybe I think your hand was up already before, so I think that would be fair.
Thank you for the intervention. I'll try to be short. Seeing that all over Europe, the right movement, far-right political parties are getting more popular, is there the possibility of seeing a new majority, no more Ursula, a majority composed by ID, ERC, and PPE, instead of the Ursula majority? Because yes, it's a diversity majority, but also the Ursula is diversity. So if there are the numbers, there is a possibility, I believe. Are there the numbers? So that's my question.
They're not the numbers and they won't work together. Yeah. Like not in a formal coalition, no.
Yeah,
No way.
they
not this time. I mean, you don't know in the future, but not this time, no.
Who knows in 2029?
Yeah.
But right now, they're not going to be above 50%. And also, they can't work together. I mean, we discussed this, ECR and ID don't work together.
And also the CDU, the EPP. And also the CDU could not go in a formal coalition yet at European Parliament level with a group that has the EFD. I mean, they have a formal sort of pledge not to do that. I mean, that might change, but they couldn't now.
Great, we disposed of them very efficiently. There is more questions in the back. I saw your hand first.
Thank you very much. I think really sticking on salience, and for me what's been quite conspicuous in its absence has been maybe the other side of the twin transition and digital. I think especially given the amount of legislative work that's happened quite recently. Does the panel think that this will have any kind of impact at all, kind of the politics of digital, the politics of tech on the next election, or is it still probably a little bit early?
Tony is...
not on voters. It won't be an issue on voters. It's of course an issue in the European Parliament legislatively, but it's not going to swing the elections. But it's definitely a big part of the legislative agenda.
Okay, great. Not an efficient one. We have more because we have more questions to go through. So, if we can, maybe we go first over there and.
Yeah. So I remember the first time I really kind of got interested in politics was sort of 2015-16, and the narrative then and what you heard was the far right is rising. They're going to kind of sweep through. Eventually, we're going to see them in governments all around the place, and that didn't really come true. I mean, they had successes, yes, but in a lot of places they kind of plateaued at that 15, 20, maybe 25% support. And now the sort of conversation that we've been having very much reminded me of that, of sort of, we've got this threat again, they're coming, they're going to be more popular, possibly in governments, et cetera, et cetera. Is this just going to be the same thing again, where we're kind of in these cycles of eventually they become a bit more popular when issues are more salient, and then they kind of plateau off, and they never really can make it there? Or is this now kind of a different kind of threat where we really are seeing possibilities that they will kind of break through that kind of maybe biggest opposition party thing, where they actually can become the largest parties in countries, not just in the European Parliament elections, but in the future after this?
So, can you hear me? Okay. To answer that, let me look at 2 or 3 countries briefly. First, Austria. You know, the idea that there was a ceiling on the vote for the radical right in Austria, I mean, all this was blown away as early as the year 2000, when the FPÖ entered a coalition government, and that government was for a few months ostracized by the rest of the EU. When they next came into government in 2017, significantly the EU did not ostracize that government. What were they like when they were in power? Heather said I seem to you said, well, they were in some ways they kind of didn't mess around with policy, and that is true, of course. But what really characterised their spelling government, as on the one hand they were absolutely riddled from top to bottom with sleaze. Secondly, they tried to infiltrate the security such that all other Europeans, let alone the Americans, stopped giving the Austrians anything at all to do with international security, you see. Thirdly, their foreign minister ended up living in St. Petersburg. So, they were a problem, actually, in Austria, but not enough for the voters to feel turned off by them, because the key thing is that rather like the Rassemblement National, as it is now called in France, has gradually come to be seen by voters as just part of the national furniture. That has been true in Austria for at least a quarter of a century, probably much longer, actually. The other country I was going to just have a few words on is Italy. In my view, it is a little bit of a mistake to characterize Meloni and the Fratelli d'Italia as some sort of evil, monstrous, far-right beast, because the party has, in its current form, is simply the latest expression of a kind of creature that has evolved rather regularly over time since the early 1950s, and over time, particularly in the era when Gianfranco Fini led it, when it was called the Alleanza Nazionale in the late 90s and early 2000s, it actually shed a lot of its polecat qualities and even became rather pro-EU. So the thing to focus on in her is not so much, is she like Orban, is this or that. The thing to remember in Italy is that the coalition that she leads is, in almost all respects, not least its composition and policies, the recreation of the Silvio Berlusconi-led governments that first came to power in 1994. The similarities in policies are quite remarkable. I mean, they go all the way from tax amnesties for people who don't pay their taxes to, let's build a bridge to Sicily. They're exactly the same policy. So although the balance, the weight of the three parties in this has changed, such that now it's the party most to the right, and it's no longer Forza Italia. Actually, the general approach of this Meloni-led government is, in my view, very similar to the Berlusconi. And if you want to look at who's disruptive as regards attitudes to the EU and eccentric or even a bit alarming in Italy, you need look no further, frankly, than Cinque Stelle or the Lega, not Meloni's party. I think she and her party, mostly her, not so much her party, but I think there's a lot of misreading of her, actually.
We have more questions. So the question is now, we have around 9 minutes to go. Would you like to reserve your comments, Sarah and Heather, for the next question? Or yeah, okay, wonderful. So there was another question in that corner. We're going sort of systematically.
So my question is, do you think that the Spitzenkandidaten process is an appropriate way to reduce the democratic deficit in the Commission, and by sort of creating a political show will increase the turnout in European elections and create a more engaged political citizens? And if so, why isn't there a stronger push for it?
The Spitzenkandidaten makes a comeback.
Sounds like one of my essay questions. I have written an excellent article on it. No.
Me too.
Well, I mean,
was it published?
It was published, yes.
Where?
Journal of European Public Policy. Okay. Well, I think the problem is for that process that it didn't fully end up playing out. I mean, of course, we did have it, and then it got killed last time, and then I think now probably the big question is the EPP would have to commit to it, and they won't because they just want the Commission president. So there's always been this tussle between the heads of states who are, of course, will not want it. Would it be, so to your question, would it solve the democratic deficit? I mean, not sort of overnight, as we didn't, because most people didn't know it was a thing. But of course, you would have to give it a chance to play out. and that it's never been given a chance, and it doesn't look like it'll be given a chance this time. So I think that's a shame. Actually, as I was asked by some of these MEPs from the EPP, oh, should we try and push it this time? And I was like, yes, because you are also MEPs. You're not just Christian Democrats. Otherwise it will die. And it was, of course, a play by the European Parliament to try and, which they've normally been quite good at, trying to get more power. But as I sort of said in my comments, I think as we stand now, they have sort of failed in really creating that link with voters. And the Spitzenkandidaten or lead candidate process would be one way of trying to at least make, if nothing else, the media more interested and therefore also voters. And I don't think it will happen as something really significant this time, and I think that's a shame. As a political scientist who like exciting elections, I think it's a shame.
So I have a more radical view. I thought it was a really stupid idea from the beginning, and I published an article in 2013 saying it was a really bad idea. But that's it's actually for the same reasons as you've just said, but with a different reasoning behind them. So one is, I think the very fact that these are second-order elections, and they do reflect moods, but they don't reflect voter choices of individuals or of particular policies. It's too much of an aggregation election, really, for people to do that. And also, normal voters do not follow these candidates. So to give you an example, we had perhaps the Spitzenkandidat contest that was most easy to understand for German voters was Jean-Claude Juncker for the centre-right against Martin Schulz for the centre-left. Both perfect German speakers. Juncker's a Luxembourger who speaks perfect German. They did a prime time German television debate, like 7 o'clock, ZDF, really perfect. And they both spoke fantastic German, and they went through all kinds of issues of great salience to Germans. How much name recognition did either of these guys have after that debate? Who would guess?
Our poll.
7% of Germans recognized either of their names. Okay, so German voters did not go to the polls on the European Parliament having in mind, I am electing Juncker, I am electing Schulz. So I think you have that problem. I think it's the other way round. I don't think Spitzenkandidat connects people to the European Parliament. You'd have to connect people first and then introduce Spitzenkandidat. And
the big question is whether you think institutions can do that. I guess that's the big, do you first have to create the European people to change the institutions, or can we change it? That's the kind of Simon Hicks would argue that, you have to change the institutions and create exciting electoral contests, and then it will come.
Well, I'd agree with you if it was a direct election. I mean, I'd be totally fine. Yeah, have a direct election. Then it's a real contest. But this is fake democracy. This is fake democracy. Because ultimately, first of all, the candidates are chosen by the European Parliament's party groupings. So, I mean, they're not chosen by the national parties in anyway. But also, fundamentally, as we saw in 2019, the European Council can just come in and completely ignore the results. So it's fake. It's a fake contest in that point of view. So my argument would be either have a direct election of the Commission President, which I think is actually not a great idea, because the Commission should be the guardian of the treaties. It should be the referee of the single market. It should be enforcing the law without having any political party bias. So I think having a Commission President who is somehow beholden to one or more parties is a serious problem. And that may happen this time. I mean, who knows what conversations Ursula von der Leyen is at this very moment having with various leaders about, I'll drop this and maybe I'll give you that and so on. It's not a good idea. She should be there as the guardian of the treaties. No, so I think what you need is a direct election if you really want drama and media coverage. And that should be for the President of the European Parliament. Keep the Commission out of it.
Okay, great. I'm glad we got a little bit of a spicy exchange. Actually, kind of reminded me of a conversation I had with an MEP that I worked for a couple of years ago about whether institutions come first or whether we first have to pursue the people. And the conversation was kind of look at all these MEPs, not him, of course. They're also stupid and incompetent. And I was like, well, of course they are, because they don't have enough power. So you first need to make the EP job more attractive so that you get better politicians. And he was not persuaded. So just an anecdote on that. We have more questions, and I think we have time just about for one or two more. I think, gentleman in the back.
Thank you for the discussion. Just a quick question on, I'd be intrigued to hear the panel's thoughts on the media and communications strategies of the parties leading up to the elections. In particular, do you think the more moderate parties are in a position to / willing to sort of respond and combat the more adversarial communications media tactics often adopted by radical parties on both the left and the right?
Well, I'm going to keep my answer very short. I haven't noticed anything. I mean, they must be trying, I guess, but I can't say I've noticed anything that really stands out on that. But I mean, they are. What I can tell you is, and you only need to go to the European Parliament building in Brussels or when they're in Luxembourg. There's a lot of resources there for that kind of stuff. I mean, they're swimming in it, actually. So it would be, if the money's not being spent on media strategies, I'd like to know what it is being spent on.
We have more questions. I think we can do one more in the fourth row.
Thanks very much indeed. I'd like to take you out into the realms of fantasy and back in history. Why is it we're talking about the radical right and no one said the word left so far in this debate? Why is there no radical left? Why effectively really is the radical right against what used to be the center? And we don't have a dimension to the left.
I'll give a very short answer and double 30. It is a good point. I mean, let me take you even further back in history. You know, the historic problem of the European left was the split between socialism and communism after the First World War, and it's never been healed. So you've always had, you don't have a communism in the old sense, as in a kind of Moscow-led communism anymore, but you do have a radical left or a hard left. The problem is that they're a bit like the conspirators in Monty Python's Life of Brian. You know, splitters, you know, the Judea People's Front, the People's Front. I mean, to give 3 examples recently, with the radical left having less influence than it might do if it was more cohesive. First, Syriza in Greece, split. Secondly, Podemos in Spain. And then, most interestingly, Die Linke in Germany, with the emergence of the Sarah Wagenknecht party. So, I mean, they're vociferous. They to use a long word, they spread up, so they have less influence than they should. But beyond that, I mean, they fight with each other within the radical left, and the radical left fights with the more moderate left, and meanwhile, none of them are listening to their traditional voters.
Maybe just to add to that, if you look at their actual policy kind of, not exactly proposals, but their preferences, radical right and radical left are not very different on economic policies. They're all pretty protectionist, pretty much against globalization, international trade, and so on. And they're all in favor of a bigger welfare state. So in terms of voter choice, it's quite tricky. But this splitting is not only on the radical left, it's also on the radical right. Both of them tend towards internal divisions and corruption. And that's what often brings them out of power rather than losing voter support.
Any last words, Sarah? Perfect. Well, okay, that's all we have time for. But before we thank our speakers, let me just say that next week there's another policy in practice, which is entitled Integrating Immigrants, How Can European Countries Do Better? So I think it's a very related theme. Having said that, if you don't follow us yet on Twitter or Instagram, there's a handle, UCLSPP. Thank you very much to all our panelists. I think it was a wonderful discussion, excellent expertise. A round of applause would be in order.